A 10-year-old boy walked barefoot into a convenience store on Chicago's Michigan Avenue, clutching just 50 cents in his hand. His clothes were torn, his stomach was empty, and his baby sister was crying from hunger at home. All he wanted was a small bag of powdered milk, just enough to quiet her cries. But what awaited him inside wasn't kindness. It was humiliation, power, and cruelty in its coldest form. And that single moment would set the stage for a promise that would echo across decades. What happens when the poorest child confronts the richest man in the room? On the bustling stretch of Chicago's Michigan Avenue, wealth and poverty existed side by side. But for Malik Johnson, only one side of that world was real. At just 10 years old, he had already learned more about sacrifice than most adults. His father had died serving in Iraq, leaving behind a family that struggled every single day. His mother, Latoya, worked 3 jobs, nursing shifts, cleaning offices, and late-night fast food shifts, until her body finally gave out. At home, his 6-month-old sister Destiny wailed from hunger, her cries echoing in their tiny apartment. That morning, Malik found only 50 cents tucked away, the last bit of change in a jar his mother had hoped to stretch for food. Barefoot and wearing clothes that no longer fit, he clutched the coins tightly in his small hand and set out toward a convenience store he had walked past many times but never dared enter. The city around him was alive. Expensive cars rolled down the street, polished shoes clicked across sidewalks, and neon signs lit the shop windows with promises of abundance. But for Malik, that store represented something else. The possibility of feeding his baby sister. He pushed the door open, heart pounding, unaware that his simple request would place him face to face with a man whose world couldn't have been more different. And in that moment, the line between power and desperation, cruelty and dignity, was about to be drawn. Malik's 50 cents would become the spark of a story that would span decades, one fueled by injustice, but destined for something far greater. The moment Malik stepped inside the convenience store, the divide between his world and theirs became painfully clear. Bright aisles stacked with food he couldn't afford stretched in every direction. The air smelled of fresh bread and coffee, but all he carried was 50 cents. Barely enough for a fraction of what he needed. Behind the counter stood the store manager, a heavy-set man with a stiff white shirt and a permanent sneer etched on his face. His eyes narrowed at the sight of Malik, taking in the torn clothes, the bare feet, the trembling hands. He didn't see a child, he saw what he believed didn't belong. "What do you want here?" The man's voice cut like a blade. Malik opened his palm, showing the coins. His voice was steady but quiet. He wasn't asking for much, just powdered milk for his baby sister. But instead of compassion, he was met with laughter. The manager leaned forward, mocking him, telling him this store wasn't for beggars. Every word dripped with contempt, not just for Malik, but for everything he represented. Poverty, struggle, and the color of his skin. The humiliation might have ended there, just another painful moment for a boy forced to grow up too fast. But then the door chimed again, and in walked Richard Whitmore. Richard was everything the city admired. A billionaire real estate tycoon in a tailored Italian suit, fresh from closing a $75 million deal. He had only stopped for bottled water, yet his presence filled the room like a storm. The manager straightened instantly, his cruelty vanishing, replaced with obsequious respect. Malik, however, stood frozen, clutching his coins tighter. When Richard's eyes landed on him, the boy saw no kindness, only cold amusement. Malik explained his sister's hunger, his mother's exhaustion, and made a desperate promise that when he grew up, he would pay Richard back. For a moment, the store fell silent. Customers turned, curious to see what the wealthy man would do. But Richard only smirked. He pulled out a crisp $200 bill, holding it up for everyone to see. His voice was sharp, mocking. If Malik wanted it, he would have to kneel before him in front of the crowd. The laughter from bystanders stung more than the demand itself. Yet Malik did not bend. His voice, firm and unshaken, declared that his father hadn't died in Iraq for his son to kneel to men like this. He called Richard the poorest man alive, not for his wealth but for his lack of character. The words cut deeper than Richard expected. The room shifted. Shoppers pulled out their phones, recording every second. The billionaire's smirk faltered. He threatened Malik's family, promising his mother would lose her job. But the boy pointed at the cameras and answered calmly. The internet never forgets. That moment in a small convenience store was no longer private. It became a stage. And though Malik walked out with little more than what he carried in, he also walked out with something stronger than money. A promise etched in fire. What neither Richard nor anyone else realized was that this small boy, armed with 50 cents and dignity, had just begun a journey that would one day bring an empire to its knees. 15 years later, the promise Malik had made as a child came roaring back to life. Richard Whitmore, now 60, sat in his gleaming office high above Chicago, surrounded by glass, steel, and power. His empire seemed untouchable. Skyscrapers bore his name, politicians answered his calls, and his arrogance had only grown with age. At parties, he still boasted of the little boy with 50 cents, turning Malik's childhood humiliation into his favorite story. But arrogance blinds. And on this day, the walls of his empire finally cracked. The doors of his office burst open. Armed FBI agents stormed in, their voices sharp and commanding. Papers flew, screens blinked, and Richard's face drained of color. At the front of the team stood a young man in a tailored suit, confidence radiating from every step. It was Malik Johnson, no longer the barefoot boy, but a federal prosecutor armed with years of evidence. The billionaire froze, unable to comprehend what he was seeing. Malik locked eyes with him, calm yet resolute, and laid file after file on the desk. Offshore accounts, bribes, evictions, scams, every crime laid bare. For years, Richard had laughed about that moment in the store, repeating it over 60 times in public speeches. But now, each retelling was another nail in his coffin, documented, recorded, undeniable. The room seemed to shrink as Malik's voice carried the weight of history. He didn't raise it, he didn't need to. The evidence spoke louder than any insult ever hurled his way. Richard had once demanded the boy kneel. Now he was the one brought to his knees, handcuffed, powerless, exposed before the world. The cameras that had once been a child's shield were now a nation's spotlight. And as Richard was led away, the promise of a 10-year-old boy echoed louder than the billionaire's empire. This was no longer just Malik's fight, it was a reckoning. The fall of Richard Whitmore was swift and merciless. Within days, his stocks collapsed, his allies abandoned him, and the man who once ruled Chicago's skyline was reduced to an inmate number in a federal prison. He would serve 25 years, stripped of power, wealth, and the reputation he once guarded like armor. But for Malik Johnson, this was never about revenge. It was about keeping a promise. The boy who once held 50 cents in his hand had grown into a man who restored billions to families robbed by corruption. His work recovered homes for the displaced, education for children, and dignity for communities Richard's greed had crushed. What began as humiliation in a convenience store ended with justice that rippled across the nation. Years later, Richard's tallest skyscraper no longer bore his name. It became the Malik Johnson Center for Social Justice, a symbol not of wealth, but of resilience. And Malik, once mocked for his poverty, became known as the prosecutor who brought down 20 corrupt billionaires, proving that integrity is more powerful than money. At home, his sister Destiny thrived. The baby who cried for milk now stood tall as a young woman, excelling in school and preparing to follow her brother's path into law. Together, they represented the future their father had fought for, a future built not on hate, but on justice. When Malik spoke publicly, his message was clear. True revenge is not destroying the one who humiliated you. True revenge is building a life of dignity, where their cruelty becomes irrelevant. And that is the truth at the heart of this story. Racism, arrogance, and greed may wound deeply, but they cannot silence resilience. So the question remains, how many more Maliks will it take before society learns? How many more children must stand against giants before dignity is valued over dollars? The internet never forgets. Neither should we. What did you think of Malik's journey, from a boy with 50 cents to the man who brought down an empire? Do you believe true justice is found in revenge or in building a better future? If the story moved you, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share it so more people can hear it.